Imagine, you come home from work and find your teenage daughter murdered.
Oh, that's awful.
Yeah, it's a nightmare scenario, right? And sadly, it became a devastating reality for Sarah Neal's family back in 2005.
It's hard to believe that it's been almost 20 years and the case is still unsolved.
I know, and that's why we're going to deep dive into Sarah's story today.
Yeah, I think this deep dive will be really interesting for our listeners.
Definitely, and we're using an episode of the true crime podcast, The Deck, to guide us.
The Deck. Okay, I've heard of that one. It's pretty popular, right?
Yeah, it is, and they do a good job laying out the details of the case. So we'll be looking at how the investigation unfolded
Okay.
and all those twists and turns, and then we'll talk about the challenges of solving cold cases.
Right, because it's not like on TV where they solve it in an hour, right?
Yeah, exactly. Real life is a lot more complicated. Plus, we'll try to understand why justice for Sarah has been so elusive.
You know what's really disturbing to me? The fact that it happened in Sarah's own home.
Yeah, you're right. You should feel safe at home.
Exactly. And as we get into the story, you'll see why it's even more complex and heartbreaking.
So let's start with Sarah herself.
Mm.
Who was she?
Sarah was 16, from Omaha, Nebraska. Really active girl. She was involved in basketball, softball, track, even chess. She had so much energy and potential, you know?
Yeah, full of life, just starting her life. And it's hard to comprehend how someone could take that away.
It really is.
So let's rewind back to that day, June 21st, 2005.
Okay.
Can you walk us through what happened?
It seemed like a normal summer day. Sarah's dad, Russell, he got home a little before 4:40 p.m.
Okay.
And, well, he walked in and had no clue about the horror waiting for him inside.
It's chilling to even think about what he must have encountered.
Absolutely chilling, he found Sarah on the kitchen floor
Yeah.
in a pool of blood,
Oh my goodness.
fully clothed like she was taken by surprise.
I can't even begin to imagine the shock and grief. I remember the podcast mentioned Sarah's mom, Nan, and how she got this heart-wrenching phone call from Russell.
Yes, Nan talks about hearing the absolute anguish in Russell's voice.
Oh.
A sound that's just stuck with her all these years.
That's just devastating.
It is. It really hits you how these tragedies impact everyone, not just the victim.
You know, I remember the podcast quickly shifted focus to a man named Cletus Alfred.
Right, Cletus.
So who was he and what was his connection to Sarah?
Well, Cletus was 28 at the time, quite a bit older than Sarah.
Yeah, significant age difference there.
And their relationship was definitely troubled. Lots of warning signs right from the start.
Like what kind of warning signs?
So a few months before the murder, Sarah actually got a protection order against Cletus.
Really?
Yeah, she reported him for stalking her and even threatening her.
That's scary. I mean, that's way beyond just a troubled relationship.
It is. And it makes you think, what led to that protection order? Was this a pattern?
Right, exactly. Was there a history of violence?
Well, the podcast actually goes into some pretty disturbing incidents from his past.
Go on.
Apparently, he had threatened a previous girlfriend, saying something like, "No one will ever see you again."
Wow, chillin'.
Right. And there were other reports of violent threats towards others.
That paints a very unsettling picture of him, doesn't it? Makes you wonder how he was even involved with someone so much younger in the first place.
Yeah, and the story takes another turn. You ready for this?
What?
Back in 2004, Cletus was charged with making explicit content, and Sarah was involved.
Wait, he was exploiting her? Before the protection order, even?
Yes, he made an explicit video of her without her consent. They actually did file charges against him, but
Oh, wow.
get this, they were dismissed.
Dismissed. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, we don't know exactly why. It definitely raises questions about how the case was handled.
It definitely does.
But later on, they refiled those charges, and he was eventually convicted.
So he did serve time.
He did. He was released from prison in 2020.
Okay, so with everything pointing to Cletus, you'd think he'd be the main suspect, right?
Of course, he was a key figure in the investigation, but even with the violence, threats, and those charges, the police were careful not to only focus on him.
That's surprising. Why not? With all that, wouldn't he be the obvious suspect?
You have to remember, tunnel vision can be a real problem in investigations.
I see what you mean.
It's crucial to stay open-minded and consider all possibilities, even if there's a seemingly clear suspect. And in Sarah's case, there were other details that made them wonder.
Like what? What else was there?
Well, the podcast talks about these accounts from neighbors. They saw some odd things around the time of the murder.
Okay, what kind of odd? Give me an example.
For instance, one neighbor saw someone cutting through her backyard, which was strange because she had a chain link fence.
That's pretty odd.
Yeah. And another neighbor saw someone on a bike nearby.
That's interesting.
It's not clear if they ever figured out who these people were or if it was connected at all.
Yeah, it's like a puzzle where some pieces are just missing.
Exactly. And unfortunately, with time, those pieces get harder and harder to find.
That's true. The more time passes, the more challenging it gets. But we'll dive into that more after the break.
We were talking about how time makes solving cases like Sarah's incredibly difficult.
Yeah, it's like trying to solve a puzzle where pieces are missing and even the picture's fading.
That's a good analogy. But there's always that glimmer of hope.
Absolutely.
Mm.
So what keeps that hope alive in these cold cases?
Well, sometimes new evidence pops up, even years later.
You mean like someone suddenly remembering something?
Yeah, exactly. Someone might have a memory they'd completely forgotten about, or maybe a witness finally feels safe enough to talk.
That makes sense. What about technology? Does that play a role?
Huge role. Technology's always advancing, especially in forensics and DNA analysis.
Right. We hear about that all the time. How could that help in a case like Sarah's?
Think about those neighbors we discussed. The one who saw someone in her backyard.
Right, right.
What if there's trace DNA there? Back then, the tech wasn't as good. But now, we might get a DNA profile from the tiniest thing.
Wow, like a skin cell, you mean?
Exactly. So a tiny piece of evidence they might have missed back then could be the key now.
That's pretty amazing.
It is. And that's why it's so important to keep the evidence and the cases open. You never know what breakthroughs are coming.
It makes you think, what if they could re-examine all the evidence in Sarah's case with today's technology?
It's definitely possible, and it's actually happened in other cold cases. It's led to some big breaks.
It's fascinating, really.
But remember, technology is only one part of it. You still need dedicated investigators, people willing to revisit these cases and look for things that might have been missed.
So it's not just about fancy equipment. It's about having that human element, too.
Precisely. It takes a special kind of dedication to work on cold cases. It's not glamorous like you see on TV.
Yeah, it seems like really meticulous work.
It is. You're going through old files, interviewing witnesses again, following leads that might not go anywhere. But when it pays off, the reward is huge.
You mean like finally bringing closure to a family that's been waiting for answers?
Exactly. That's got to be an incredible feeling.
I bet. Going back to those neighbors, though, I'm curious, did the podcast say if they ever figured out who those people were? Or if they were connected to the crime?
Unfortunately, no, they didn't go into detail about that.
Oh, okay.
But it does make you wonder, right? Could one of them have been involved? Or maybe they saw something important but didn't realize it at the time.
Maybe they thought it wasn't a big deal or were just too scared to say anything?
That's definitely possible. And this is where podcasts like The Deck and even our discussions here can help. Keeping these cases in the public eye might jog someone's memory.
Yeah, or encourage them to come forward.
Exactly. You never know. A tiny detail, something someone might not even remember, could be that missing piece of the puzzle.
It's amazing how something so small could be so important.
It really is. Never underestimate the power of information, no matter how insignificant it seems.
You know, I remember hearing about a case where a witness came forward years later just because they saw a news report about the anniversary of the crime.
Wow, really?
Yeah, and it was something they had completely forgotten about. But seeing it on TV brought it all back, and their memory was crucial to cracking the case.
You see, it happens. It's a reminder that even in cold cases, there's always that hope.
Okay, so let's talk about Cletus Alford for a minute. The podcast really focused on him, but he was never actually charged with Sarah's murder, right?
That's right. He served time for those charges related to the explicit video and was released back in 2020. I know the podcast producers reached out to him. They wanted to get his side of the story.
Did he respond?
No, they never heard back from him.
Yeah, I can understand why he might not want to talk about it.
It's understandable, but his silence does leave us with a lot of unanswered questions.
Definitely. I guess it shows how complex these cases can be, even if there's a prime suspect. Sometimes there just isn't enough to press charges.
Exactly. Or maybe the evidence isn't admissible in court for some reason.
That must be incredibly frustrating for Sarah's family, knowing the person they believe is responsible might never be held accountable.
Oh, absolutely. Not having that closure on top of everything else, it just adds another layer of pain and trauma.
It's unimaginable. You know, the podcast played a really powerful clip of Sarah's mom, Nan.
Yes, when she spoke at Cletus Alford's sentencing.
Right. Can you remind us about that?
It was for the charges related to the explicit video. Nan wasn't allowed to talk about Sarah's murder during her statement, but what she said was still so powerful.
I remember that. Even though she couldn't directly address it, you could feel the pain of her loss in every word.
Absolutely. And it really shows how these crimes impact everyone, not just the immediate victim.
The ripples spread so far.
They do. And Nans turned her pain into action, becoming an advocate for other victims of abuse.
That's so inspiring.
It really is. She's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to find a way to do good after such unimaginable loss.
I find that so admirable.
Me too. And you know, there's another part of the story that gives us a glimpse into Sarah's own thoughts and feelings before her death. The podcast mentioned she wrote poetry.
Oh, right. And some of it almost foreshadowed what was going to happen.
Yes, it's insightful, but so heartbreaking too. She wrote about feeling lost, alone, struggling with trust, being scared to ask for help.
It makes you wonder if she was trying to reach out in her own way through her writing.
It's definitely possible. It reminds us to pay attention, to truly listen to what young people are telling us, whether directly or indirectly.
That's such an important point. So before we go any further, you said earlier to never give up on these cold cases. How can investigators and the public work together to keep these cases alive and hopefully bring justice to victims like Sarah? We're back and diving right back into Sarah Neal's case. It feels like we've uncovered so much, but there's still a lot of unanswered questions, like a puzzle with missing pieces.
Yeah, definitely. This case really sticks with you. You think about her young life, her potential, and how it was all taken away, and her family still waiting for answers after all this time. It really makes you think about how justice delayed can be just as bad as justice denied.
You said earlier there's always hope, even in these cold cases. What specifically makes you hopeful in Sarah's case?
Well, there's always the possibility that new evidence will come to light. You never know, right?
Right.
Someone might suddenly remember something they saw or heard, something they dismissed as unimportant years ago.
Like those neighbors, maybe?
Mm.
The one who saw someone in the backyard or the person on the bike?
Exactly. What if those details are more significant than we initially thought? It's like we just need that one piece to make everything click into place.
It's amazing to think that something seemingly insignificant, something someone might have forgotten about, could be the key to cracking the case wide open.
And then there's the technology aspect. We've talked about DNA analysis, but there are so many other tools and techniques that could help in Sarah's case. Like, what if there's touch DNA evidence at the crime scene that couldn't be analyzed back in 2005? Now we might be able to get a profile from that and find a match in a database.
So even though the case has gone cold, there's still a chance for new discoveries as technology keeps getting better.
Precisely. And it's not just the technology. Investigative techniques are evolving too. Detectives who specialize in cold cases, they're trained to look at these cases with a fresh perspective, searching for any patterns, connections, or inconsistencies that might have been missed before.
So it's a combination of new technology, new techniques, and that human element of dedicated investigators.
Absolutely. And before we completely move on from Cletus Alfred, do you think there's any chance he could still be held accountable for Sarah's murder, even though he wasn't charged?
That's a good question.
It's definitely a long shot, but not impossible. But for that to happen, investigators would need to find some pretty convincing new evidence that directly links him to the crime.
What kind of evidence are we talking about?
It could be anything, really. A witness who comes forward with new information, physical evidence placing him at the scene. Maybe someone remembers seeing him in the neighborhood that day, or they overhear a conversation that raises some red flags.
Makes you wonder if there's someone out there who knows something but hasn't come forward yet. Maybe they're afraid, or they just don't realize how important the information they have could be.
It's possible, and that's why it's crucial for investigators to build trust with potential witnesses, to create a safe space where they feel comfortable sharing information, knowing they'll be taken seriously and protected.
Okay, let's talk more about Sarah's poetry. The podcast mentioned that her writing gave a glimpse into her state of mind leading up to her death. What did you find most striking about her poetry?
Her poetry was so insightful, you know. It was like she was pouring her heart out onto the page. She wrote about feeling isolated, about struggling to trust people, about being afraid to ask for help.
Reading those words, knowing what ultimately happened to her, it's just heartbreaking. It's almost like a cry for help that went unheard.
It really is, and it makes you think about the importance of paying attention, not just to young people, but to everyone around us. Sometimes people are hurting, but they don't always express it directly. We need to be sensitive to those subtle signs, to listen without judgment, and offer support when we can.
That's a really powerful message. We all have a responsibility to create a society where people feel safe and supported, where they feel comfortable asking for help when they need it.
And Sarah's mom, Nan, said something in the podcast that really resonated with me. She talked about how Sarah had this incredible strength, but she was also afraid to show her vulnerability.
I think a lot of people can relate to that, not just young people. We often feel like we had to put on a brave face, even when we're struggling inside.
It's true. We need to create spaces where vulnerability is okay, where people can express their true feelings without fear of judgment.
Well said. As we wrap up our deep dive into Sarah's case, I'm left feeling a mix of sadness and hope. Sadness for the loss of such a promising young life, but also hope that maybe, someday, her case will be solved.
I feel the same way. Even though the case has gone cold, Sarah's story isn't over. Her family deserves answers, and Sarah deserves justice.
And if anyone listening has any information about Sarah's case, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, please contact the Omaha Police Department. You might hold that missing piece of the puzzle that finally brings closure to this tragedy.
And if you're out there and you're struggling, please remember you're not alone. Reach out to someone you trust, a friend, a family member, a professional. There is help available, and there is always hope.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We hope we've shed light on the complexities of cold cases, the importance of keeping these stories alive, and the enduring power of hope and resilience.
And as always, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep the conversation going. We'll see you next time.